For decades, veteran John Mitchell carried the scars of Vietnam, only to be told by his own country that his service never existed. Behind that denial stood a faceless system, hiding its failures behind words like lost files and bureaucratic errors. But everything shifted when one determined attorney uncovered the missing report that proved John's sacrifice. And just wait until you hear how this long fight ended, with a twist that turned silence into justice. In the spring of 1971, John Mitchell stepped off a bus in Ohio with nothing but a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. The world around him looked the same as when he had left. Quiet suburban streets, houses with neat lawns, and the smell of fresh rain on the pavement. Yet to him, everything was different. He carried with him invisible scars, the kind that don't fade. His body bore the marks of long marches, sleepless nights, and injuries that never fully healed. His mind carried the weight of moments no one back home would ever truly understand. John had survived 2 years in Vietnam. He had faced the constant uncertainty of not knowing if the next step on a dirt trail might be his last. He had written letters home, careful never to mention the worst details, protecting his family from the realities he lived with daily. And like so many soldiers, he dreamed of the moment he would come back, when all of it would finally be behind him. He imagined shaking hands, hearing words of thanks, and perhaps even finding peace. But the homecoming he envisioned never arrived. Instead of parades or recognition, he was met with indifference. Neighbors avoided questions, colleagues offered only polite nods, and strangers treated him as if his years overseas were nothing more than a gap in his resume. And when he walked into the Department of Veterans Affairs, seeking the help he had been promised, the coldness became unbearable. A clerk with a tired expression scanned his file. The office smelled faintly of dust and old paper. John stood silently, waiting for acknowledgement. Then came the words that would stay with him for the rest of his life. There is no record of your combat service. You are not eligible for benefits. At first, John thought it was a mistake. Surely some document had been misplaced, a signature forgotten, a form left unfiled. He tried to explain. He had been in the field, he had been injured, he had served honorably. His voice grew tight as he listed the battles, the unit numbers, the names of men who never made it home. But the clerk's expression never changed. The answer was final. It felt like the ground dropped beneath him. The sting of those words was sharper than any wound he had carried from Vietnam. Out there in the jungle, he had at least known the risk. He had faced danger with brothers who trusted him with their lives. But here, in the very office meant to serve those who gave everything, he was dismissed with a sentence, as if his sacrifices had been erased with the stroke of a pen. Walking out of that building, John felt something shift inside him. It wasn't only about the loss of benefits, though those were desperately needed for his health and his future. It was the feeling of being branded a liar by the country he had fought to defend. That betrayal cut deeper than any physical scar. And as he stood outside, clutching his worn duffel bag, one thought consumed him. All the men he had buried overseas deserved better than this silence. The years slipped by like sand through an open hand. What John thought would be a temporary mistake at the Veterans Affairs Office became a shadow that followed him for decades. The promise that had been broken in that small government room lingered in every corner of his life, shaping who he became and how he carried himself. At first, he tried to move forward. He took a job at the factory, working long shifts surrounded by the hum of machinery. The steady rhythm of metal and gears became his new battlefield, one where survival depended on endurance rather than courage. His coworkers knew him as a reliable man, someone who never complained, someone who always finished the job. What they didn't see was the quiet effort it took for him to rise each morning, to ignore the sharp aches in his body, and to wear a smile that often felt borrowed. When the factory closed, John found work in construction, heavy lifting, long hours under the sun, and endless fatigue became part of his routine. The years etched deep lines into his face, but he never spoke of the pain. Pride kept him silent, as if admitting weakness would mean the system had won. At night, however, there was no hiding. Sleep was fragile, broken by restless dreams that left him staring at the ceiling long after midnight. He would sit in the dark living room, the quiet ticking of a clock the only sound. His wife, Carol, would sometimes wake and find him there. She would stand in the doorway, watching the man she loved sit motionless, as if caught between the past and the present. "Did you write them again?" she would ask softly. "Yes," he would reply, his gaze fixed on nothing. "Another rejection." The answer was always the same. Every envelope from the department arrived like a blow. The words inside were cold, written in careful, official language that made the denial feel inevitable. Each letter was another reminder that, to those who held the records, his service did not exist. Each denial was another nail in the coffin of his faith in justice, and yet he kept trying. Year after year, he filled out forms, mailed requests, and gathered what little evidence he had left. Old photographs, fading certificates, the names of men who had once stood by his side. He sent them all, and each time the reply came back unchanged. The burden of rejection grew heavier with every passing decade. It was not only about money or benefits, it was about recognition, about truth. John felt as though the country he had defended had quietly turned its back, leaving him to fight alone against an enemy far more relentless than any he had faced overseas. Silence. Through it all, Carol stayed by his side. She saw the toll it took on him, how the weight bent his shoulders, how it dimmed his laughter. But she also saw the quiet strength in the man who refused to give up, even when hope seemed to shrink to almost nothing. Still, in his heart, John carried the bitter knowledge. The nation he had served had betrayed his trust. And no matter how many years passed, that truth cut deeper than time itself. For years, John Mitchell's life had been defined by rejection letters and silence. Then, when hope seemed all but gone, something unexpected happened. A young attorney named Michael Harper came across John's case by chance. Michael was the son of a veteran, and he had grown up watching his own father wrestle with the memories of service. When he read the old files on John's denied claims, something stirred in him, a mixture of frustration and determination. At first glance, the records looked ordinary. Stamped documents, lists of dates, neatly typed lines that seemed to tell a complete story. But Michael noticed something strange. The section where the battle reports should have been was empty. It wasn't a simple clerical mistake. It looked as though a crucial piece of John's service history had disappeared entirely. Where others had shrugged and closed the file, Michael refused to stop. He believed that behind the missing pages was the truth that John had been fighting to prove for decades, and so he began a process that demanded both persistence and patience. He sent letters, filed requests, and followed paper trails that led him deep into the archives of forgotten records. Weeks turned into months, but he didn't give up. Finally, one afternoon, an envelope arrived at his small office. Inside was a faded document, the kind of fragile paper that carried the weight of history. Across the top, in military type, was the report that had been missing for so long. The words were clear and unmistakable. Sergeant John Mitchell, wounded in action during combat operations. Michael read the line twice, his heart racing. This was more than ink on paper. It was proof. Proof that John's story was real, that his sacrifice had been recorded, and that somewhere along the way, the system had failed him. When John held the letter in his hands, time seemed to stop. His eyes scanned the page slowly, as if afraid the words might vanish if he blinked. And then, for the first time in many years, the weight he carried began to lift. Tears welled in his eyes, not out of weakness, but out of release. The release of decades of silence, finally giving way to recognition. Carol sat beside him, her hand resting gently on his arm. She didn't need to say anything. The sight of her husband, a man who had endured so much, finally allowing himself to believe in hope again, was enough. In that moment, the denials, the nights of doubt, the endless waiting, they all seemed to fade. For the first time in decades, John's story had a chance to be heard. It was not victory yet, but it was the beginning of one. That single page of paper, pulled from the shadows of forgotten archives, carried the promise of justice. And as John folded it carefully, almost reverently, he knew that his fight was no longer just his own. Someone believed him. Someone was willing to stand beside him. For the first time in years, John looked ahead and saw not just pain, but possibility. The courtroom was not grand, but for John Mitchell, it felt like the stage where his entire life had led. For decades, he had walked through doors of rejection, endured cold offices, and faced the silence of lost files. Now, at last, he stood in a place where the truth could no longer be ignored. Beside him was Michael Harper, the young attorney who had refused to give up. In Michael's hands lay the faded battle report, the very document that had been buried in the shadows for years. Its edges were worn, its ink faint, but its words carried more weight than any argument. The government officials shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Their language was polished, their excuses carefully worded. lost documents, administrative oversight, unfortunate mistakes. Yet each phrase rang hollow in the air, because across the room stood John, no longer the young soldier of 1971, but a man marked by time, with gray hair and a back slightly bent, yet with eyes that burned with the same resolve that once carried him through the jungles of Vietnam. When the judge gave him the chance to speak, John rose slowly. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the podium, but his voice, though roughened by years of silence, carried a strength that silenced the room. "I am not asking for mercy," he said, his tone steady. "I am only asking for the truth." Those words, simple yet unyielding, cutted through the polished defenses of bureaucracy. For decades, the system had reduced his story to a number, a missing page, a clerical oversight. But now, in this room, he was no longer invisible. He was a man whose sacrifice had been recorded, whose service could no longer be denied. The judge leaned forward, the courtroom quiet enough to hear the shuffle of papers. And then came the decision. The ruling was clear. John Mitchell's service was to be officially recognized, and he was to be compensated for the long years of denial. For a moment, John simply stood there, unable to move. The words sank in slowly, like sunlight breaking through a storm that had lasted half a lifetime. Michael handed him the official letter, the proof of victory. John pressed it to his chest, his eyes glistening, and whispered, "This isn't just for me. It's for all of us." Word of his triumph spread quickly among veteran communities. Men and women who had long felt forgotten saw in John's story a reflection of their own struggles. His victory was not just personal, it became a symbol, a reminder that the truth, no matter how deeply it may be buried under dust and neglect, still has the power to rise. In veteran halls, in family kitchens, in quiet conversations among those who had carried silent burdens for years, John's story was retold. It was not the tale of defeat, but of endurance, proof that even after decades of silence, justice could still be restored. John Mitchell's journey ended not in bitterness, but in inspiration. He had fought for recognition not only for himself, but for the brothers he left behind, for the ones whose stories remained untold. And through his persistence, he gave others the courage to believe that no truth is ever truly lost. For the first time in half a century, he could look back not with anger, but with peace, and forward with hope.